Hello, everybody. Welcome to Raising Vibrations. You're with Simon today. And in today's video, we're going to be looking at the full moon in Leo. And this is for the 28th of January, 2021. I hope that this video finds you in a place where you're okay amongst a lot of the very evident changing energy around us at the moment, the shifts that are taking place for us, and of course, the planetary activations that are reshaping the landscape of our internal world at the moment. So I'm really excited to actually be talking to you today with this full moon in Leo for many reasons. The astrology chart at the moment is lit up like a Christmas tree from my point of view. And I think that there's some wonderful little pieces of information that we can dig out of the collective memory and bring it to the surface and get us to see the beauty of looking at astrology in a very deep and complex way. Just before I kind of jump into today's video and share with you what it is that illuminates me in this conversation, the subscriber count for this channel is increasing quite a lot over the last 2 months. So for those of you that are new to this channel, welcome. And I really hope that you enjoy the way that I present astrology and the way that you find these new moon and full moon reports and any other material that I create to be nourishing to you. And for those of you that have been following RV for some time, once again, I deeply appreciate your desire to support this, to find value in it, and to give me the feedback that allows me to see that this is actually meaningful in some way. Okay, cool. So let's start out with a kind of a breakdown of the full moon in Leo. All right. There are 3 sections to this content that I want to create today. I want to talk about the nature of time and healing, and talking about the awakening through the planetary nodes of Neptune, which of course where this sun moon energy exists at the moment. Talking about trauma and processing, and really getting into this Uranus transit that we're dealing with at the moment. It's been activated recently with the moon crossing it. Mars was right on top of that when the moon crossed it just a few days ago. So that I've been talking about this Uranus in Taurus squaring Saturn, squaring Jupiter, squaring now the sun. So there's a lot of energy that's materializing itself there, and materials coming to the surface for us to witness, process, and digest. So we'll do that. I'm going to talk about Neptune square the nodes as well, kind of really sharing some of my thoughts on that as well. And then at the end of this video, which I hope that you'll stay around for, is a really cool sharing that I've been kind of deeply interested in at the moment over the last at least 4 or 5 days. So I'm just going to be talking about that as well, and kind of tying it into the significance of planetary nodes at the moment, and also really tying in the astrology in a very deeper way. But I don't want to let you know what that is, because that would ruin the excitement of it. But there are timestamps in this video, so you can go to these different sections and listen to different parts of this full moon in Leo video. Okay. All right. So the thing that I want to kind of just start off with is, talking about Uranus, talking about the planetary nodes at the moment. I want to put some emphasis on this, because I think it's significant when planetary nodes are activated. For those of you that don't know what a planetary node is, essentially, when you look at your actual birth chart, you will notice that there is a south node and a north node of your moon. Okay. And so generally speaking, we interpret those nodes as directions that you think you need to go in order to fulfill some sense of destiny. Okay. My thoughts on that is that while that may help us in terms of trying to making sense of these abstract points in space, it's not necessarily the case that it works that sort of simplistically. So the planetary nodes are an extension of they are the same. They have the same context as the moon's nodes. So there are 2 points in space, and they reference a historical expression, and they reference a potential expression that creates a sense of time and space. In other words, moving from one place to another. So the planetary nodes are exactly what they are. They are the nodes of Pluto, the north and south node of Pluto, the north and south node of Uranus, the north and south node of Neptune. Now, those three that I've mentioned, are outer planets. So the context of those planetary nodes affect generations of people, like generations. So when we experience a planetary node activation, what exists for us on the surface is material that will trigger deep memory within our collective. So we would become sensitive to events and circumstances and scenarios that would not just trigger your individual experience, but would trigger the collective's direction. Okay. So does everybody kind of grasp the magnitude of planetary nodes in the sense that when especially these three outer planets, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, get activated, we see a collective shift of or development of awareness, right? And it will generally show up as a kind of reaction to the way that we have internalized our reality as a human race, how we have defined ourselves as a human race. And again, it also points to the way that we exist on this plane, right? The framework to which we see reality is deeply embedded in the way that these planetary nodes exist. And so ultimately they shape us, they shape the way that our consciousness gets funneled. Okay, so it's a larger scale of your personal node. Yeah. Okay, so Uranus sits now, if I'm not mistaken, let's go to the chart itself. Let's go to the chart. There we go. And as you can see, the 28th of January, 2021, here in Sweden, it is at 15 minutes past 8 in the evening. And this sits at 9 degrees of Aquarius, 9 degrees of Leo, right? So there's the full moon. As you can see there's the sun sitting at 9 degrees. And the planetary node of Neptune is sitting literally here. Okay. There. That is the planetary node of Neptune. So the planetary node of Neptune's line exists like so. So we currently have the sun activating the south node of Neptune. Okay, so Neptune at the moment is currently sitting there, but its south node is sitting here and it stays there, right? It doesn't move. It moves very, very slowly over hundreds of years. So it's not something that we have different places for it. We, as a collective, all share the planetary node of Neptune sitting here between 4 and say 10 degrees of Aquarius, right? So we've got the sun, we've got Jupiter, and we've got Saturn all sitting on the planetary node at the moment of Neptune. So it's really significant, this moon itself. Okay, it's not just highlighting something random. It's speaking to the collective. Okay. Now Uranus at the moment sits here in Taurus at 6 degrees, and you can see the Mars, it sits at 10 degrees. Okay. And as you can see, they are squaring, right? Making a 90 degree. There we go. There's the square symbol. Mars squares the sun, Mars squares the moon, Mars squares your, sorry, not Uranus. Let me just do this over here. Mars is squaring Jupiter, as you can see there as well. Okay. So now what you're looking at is a 90-degree aspect. And as I was explaining to somebody yesterday, it was a really great conversation around this. And when we experience squares when two planets are trying to communicate with each other, right? So they're having a conversation. There's kind of a tension that exists between these two in this conversation, right? So I'm sure when you've had a conversation with somebody and you felt tension over there, right? That's what a square would feel like, right? This tension, and it's trying to resolve something. But what it's saying is you can't resolve the problem with the same thinking that created it, right? Albert Einstein. So you can't solve the problem with the same thinking that created it. And this is kind of the dynamic that's occurring here at the moment with the sun, Jupiter, Saturn in Aquarius, is that there is a necessary need to individuate and innovate and step outside of the paradigm of thinking, the paradigm of ideologies, the framework of perspectives that we as a society, as a human race, have been ultimately trying to make sense of our world, right? There is a paradigm shift that is occurring, and that paradigm shift is ignited by this Mars energy that connects over Uranus. Okay. So the moon, which sits there, is now also squaring Uranus. It's also squaring Mars, of course, and it's making a T square that's occurring there. So we have a planetary node, T square, along with planets that are more sort of like able for us to digest, because we can relate to Saturn in a sense that it is the boundaries of our reality. It's our limitation. We feel something that's very solid. And so it reflects to us where this limitation is, right? So Saturn, where is the structure? So there's a structural there's a structural change that is occurring internally for us at the moment. And these planetary positions reflect the struggle in which two forces, one pointing to the necessary need for innovation and liberation, or to decentralize, and the other part of it pointing to the necessary need to not project the outdated or outmoded thinking patterns that would lead to certain complexes within our collective, complex scenarios, situations, and circumstances that lead to disruption, lead to chaos, lead to issues that are currently revolving in our collective awareness at this moment in time. There is a necessary need to look at it differently. So these planetary energies are essentially pointing to a natural shift that is taking place, but the experience of that natural shift is like two people that are forced into a room that need to figure things out, but are unfortunately not able to communicate effectively because the thinking patterns that they both hold inside of themselves limits their ability to transcend those patterns. Okay. All right. And so what does this mean individually for us? Well, it means that internally within us, we are all influenced by and conditioned by cultural ideas, cultural truths, cultural perspectives that no longer are relevant for this moving forward energy. And the underlying dynamic within this energy, I would say, is codependency. Okay. Individuation, in other words, to like ultimately process out of yourself where expectations, needs are being externalized and then them not being met, and then through that process leading to a cascading effect of emotional responses and reactions where those issues are being highlighted. Okay, so it's kind of leading into more of the individual work here, which I'll compound for you guys. Okay, so the planetary node over here is that it's not just one person, it's the collective dealing with this issue. So we see collective bursts of emotional anger and frustration and complexity reveal itself in different ways. Okay. All right. So it's kind of a shared experience. Now, the other thing that I want to point across over here with Aquarius energy and the planetary nodes here as well is that this energy is pointing to a resolution that must occur at a collective level. It's a revolution at a collective level. Okay. All right. So Jen was pointing out to me over here as well that this was something that was really crucial to talk about. And so if some of you don't know the gene keys or Richard Rudd or the I Ching, right? If you look at the I Ching or hexagram 49, or if you look at the gene key 49, Richard Rudd talks about the emotional reaction to where needs are not being able to be met. Okay. Right? He's talking about that we all have an emotional connection to where our needs can't be met, or scenarios that occur that trigger us to experience an unresolved need, or a need that is not met. Okay. So what he's referring to here is that we all have an essential need, right? We all have this biological essential need to eat, to sleep, to interact, and for many other things. Now, we as a human race have externalized those fundamental needs to things that are, in a sense, pleasurable, right? And when we become emotionally invested into those non-essential needs, and they are, say, through a disturbance, a scenario or a situation, and a disturbance takes place, and you can't facilitate or meet that need, it creates a kind of schism within the brain's chemistry that says to you, well, this is really disturbing, or this sucks, or, oh my gosh, here's a scenario or situation that is, making me aware that this need that I want to have met is not being met. And so it creates a reaction. It creates a reaction where we feel disgruntled, or we feel upset, or we feel pissed off, right? And the invitation here with this energy is to look at scenarios and situations that are coming into your life right now that trigger, right, a need. And in this case, not an essential need, but any form of need for that matter, just any need that shows up, right? And how you react to that. And this can be as subtle as the coffee machine breaks and you can't have your morning coffee, and that leads you to being off kilter for the day for your routine, to, say, for instance, the email not coming through at the rate that you want it to come through. And so therefore this kind of need within yourself to be seen at a faster pace than what, say, the outer circumstances are leading to, and then examining the underlying need as to why that attachment's there to begin with. And the reason why this is the case is because of Pluto and Venus. As you can see, Pluto sitting at 25 degrees has got a new phase conjunction to Venus. And this Venus-Pluto conjunction points to whenever you're dealing with Pluto, you're dealing with something that is the bottom line, right? It's the core of it. So what's the bottom line, right? And so with Venus transiting over this Pluto, it's an elimination of needs and attachments that are ultimately and essentially externalized. So where we've externalized our needs in order to have something met, and when it's not mirrored to us in the way that is convenient for us in some way, shape, or form, it triggers that emotion. So this Pluto-Venus energy, as you can see, the ruler of Uranus and Mars at the moment is Venus, which is conjunct Pluto. Pluto is in Capricorn, Venus is in Capricorn. Saturn is the planet that is associated with Capricorn, so Saturn becomes the ruler. Ruler of Saturn is Uranus, and you can see here that it just bounces between the three, right? So we have this clear circuitry between Saturn, Venus, and Pluto, and then these energies here. So it's it's bringing to the surface collective wounding, trauma, displaced energy, shock, etc., where we want a fundamental need to be met. That fundamental need can't be met in some way, shape, or form relative to our own specific ways in which we condition that reality. And then when that reality is triggered or dismantled in some way, it creates an emotional reaction at a Plutonian level, and it becomes to the surface. So we're reactive. And the intention with this energy over here is to point to the liberation from externalized patterns of needs that cannot be fulfilled within yourself. Because maybe you haven't been able to, you haven't been like, we as a society have not actually been able to, at a collective level, given that ability to meet that own need inside. So we externalize that. And then when that externalized need is not met, it reinforces to us some form of complexity. We feel abandoned, we feel betrayed, we feel pissed off, we feel anger, and then we project that back onto the person or the thing that created that issue to begin with. And so there we become osmosed with the attachment, and we become dysregulated relative to the external attachment. So this energy here is pointing to the necessary need to heal those complexes by first becoming aware of what the root cause of it is. And the way that you do that simply is by tuning into that this scenario has brought this type of experience for you, A. B, then you acknowledge that emotion in yourself as your own and not the causing subject outside of yourself. And then C, you can sit with that and kind of explore what that means. Why is that attachment there? And it's through that process you begin to ultimately create a revolution with inside of yourself, right? That's the revolution here. And that's why this correlates to codependency, because again, our sense of self for the most time has been objectified. And so the objectification of your identity has led to your sense of self-worth being related to what you can do or what you are conditioned by, as opposed to what it is that you are. It's inside of you. Because inside of us, we have a core emotional journey that is individuated. It's not the same as everybody else. So your experience of life, your experience of reality doesn't get nourished as much as you, as say, for instance, just living your life. It doesn't mean all of us. There's lots of people out there that are watching this video that will say, yeah, but that's not true for me. Yeah, that's right. But certain aspects of your persona would need to be, in a sense, pushed aside to meet a certain expectation or to meet a certain relatability to life. And when you haven't been able to do that, or you've decided to disown that part of yourself and say, nope, I refuse to conform, you get isolated and rejected. So it doesn't matter. Either way, there's complex sacrifice that takes place. So that sacrificed dynamic would have created an emotional complex inside of yourself. So this is where this energy is going. It's like leading to the elimination of complex, unresolved needs that are projected outwardly through a collective ideology that's influenced by that, right? Don't be selfish because, selfish this. Don't say no because when you put a boundary in place, the other person might feel offended and I don't want to hurt them. So therefore I'll sacrifice myself kind of dynamics. These are the types of collective themes that would take place. And so the less people become externalize their need for safety, security, and they internalize it for themselves, the more empowered you will actually become, because you're reclaiming where that sensitivity or dysregulation will occur. Because again, you're not actually placing the power outside of yourself. You're placing it, you're returning it to yourself, which is a process in and of itself. It's not just a one-day thing. But this is ultimately what this energy is pointing to within the chart. So it's really fascinating to me in this sense. Okay, so I want to just stop over to this little chart over here, because it's kind of a way of describing what I'm talking about astrologically and as well. So here what we have is the Taurus archetype, and this is your personal needs. Okay, personal needs. Here's the 7th house, which is a relationship to how you project those needs outwardly. Okay, so how you project those needs outwardly, 7th house, to other people. And then there's a natural square that takes place between the Capricorn Cancer axis. And so what happens is we create circumstances or scenarios. Okay, and those scenarios or circumstances will ultimately be put in place, because it's a sense of safety, it's your comfort zone, it's what you feel comfortable with. And anything outside of that comfort zone will cause a dysregulation, right? So whatever projected need is placed outside of yourself, if that is in some way, shape, or form not met relative to that boundary you place, it will then create a chain reaction into the emotional internal self, which will cause a collapse, that you don't know how to meet that scenario outside of what it is that you've put a boundary around. And then B, that will then lead to an emotional projection dynamic, which will then in turn cause this 7th house, 2nd house dynamic to occur. So Jeffrey Wolf Green used to talk about it as a crisis, because we would then become confronted by the issue of where we've externalized our need, 8th house to 2nd house. And that's then 2nd house dynamic would force us inward, right? And we would need to evaluate our inner relationship to the self. And we're kind of living in a world right now where our society and our government structures have created the idea of security and safety. And for a lot of us, we need to project that need into them because, well, they're the authorities. So in a sense, this is about really coming into understanding that when that is projected out there, the potential for not being seen or not being heard or not being recognized will play out. B, it will trigger survival dynamics that will cause complexes, right? People will act in very kind of animalistic ways because, of course, this is the fear dynamic that shows up. Ultimately, your fears for survival, your fear for safety, your fear for freedom, these things get triggered. This is the kind of complex that's showing up, right? So there's that over there. And then the other thing that I wanted to talk about, and this was Neptune square the nodes at the moment. And, you know, the thing here is that there's this ideal at the moment with Neptune. So it's 18 degrees there. And then you have the squares to the nodes. Okay. So whenever Neptune comes into contact with any form of planets, there's two dynamics that take place. One, it reveals where the spirit no longer exists through something that is evaporating. So the spirit disappears. And then B, it also reveals where growing potential of inspiration and meaning actually comes out of it. So that's why Neptune will correlate to meaninglessness and also where meaning will exist. Now, because Neptune is also in itself something that's kind of unseen, we as human beings need to project a meaning into something in order for us to emotionally evolve through it. Otherwise, it wouldn't be appealing and attractive. So things like, for instance, religious ideals that will show up, like QAnon as an example, that energy will show up because it is a projected ideal and it holds a sense of identity for collective. And it is a space in which people's identity can be found within. And again, the cause for these types of dynamics is rooted in this here, because ultimately this over here. So I draw it in this color. Okay, this is just one example. There are many. You'll see religious dynamics start to show up absolutely at this point in time. A, because the planetary nodes of Uranus are activated. B, because Neptune is squaring the planetary nodes of Uranus. And D, the reason why these things would show up for us collectively is because there is a necessary need to objectify, decondition, and liberate from internalized images of ourselves that are linked with the past, that no longer represent the future. And the message of the future in terms of this is individuation. It is to separate one's shared ideal from everybody else. You're not on the same timeline as everybody else. We share the same space, but we're not on the same timeline. We have different emotional spaces. And in our past, we have collectively agreed to a same timeline, but that same timeline then leads people to say, well, this is not where I am, but I'm going to put myself aside in order to meet that, because A, fear of rejection, B, fear of judgment, C, not being able to survive in terms of group ideals. So this is what is ultimately occurring here. This is an Aquarius age message. And these energies will just further promote this energy. And those will see the message, they'll transform within themselves and create a revolution. And those that will not will ultimately feel consistently abandoned, betrayed, lost, and forgotten by the people, those that are not sensitive enough to meet those needs ultimately. So the frame and fillers that I want to talk about with Neptune square the nodes is that every single one of us needs a frame in order to conceptualize reality. Mine, I'm using astrology, right? Outside of that framework, I can still interpret reality using a different framework, but ultimately the lens I'm using is this one. And you, to a certain degree, are filtering your reality to a certain degree through this, amongst other ways that you filter it. And so Sagittarius, Gemini, Pisces, and Virgo, which are mutable signs, they speak to where these things get filtered through. So the fact that we have the planetary node of Neptune, the planetary node of Uranus, which sits over here, by the way, as you can see, the planetary node of Uranus sits there. In fact, the nodes are just off it at the moment. It's between like 9 and 13, right? Even a little bit earlier, but 8 degrees. So 8 degrees is Sagittarius to around 13. And in fact, it goes up to 16. So it's in that space over there. This is the north node of Uranus. This is the south node of Uranus. And so now we have Neptune squaring those planetary nodes. So again, Uranus squares the planetary nodes of Aquarius and, of Neptune, and Neptune squares the planetary nodes of Uranus. And what that looks like collectively is us all in this experience in which we're seeing fanatical beliefs starting to show up. We're seeing collective ideologies and truths beginning to show up. And what you're seeing here is that this is giving people the framework to be able to digest, interpret, and make sense of reality relative to the, I would say, deconditioning or dismantling of frameworks and structures that once held a certain idea of how we lived. So imagine that you're kind of seeing reality in one way, and then all of a sudden it just starts fraying around the edges and it dissolves into the ocean. Well, then the entire sense of self-image that one used as a collective would not be there. And so that creates uncertainty, it creates fear, it creates displacement, it creates all sorts of complexes. So in order to kind of create stability, surety, assurance, certainty, we recreate frames that hold a certain ideology that would represent an inner shadow within ourselves. And then that becomes the projected experience for all of us. So this energy over here is revealing the complexity of A, the human race at this point in time and what we're dealing with, but B, it also references a necessary, or it's a necessary shift and pointing towards an individual self. And that's why me and this Raising Vibrations channel is existing, because while I may not necessarily fully understand the scope of it, the idea that I get internally, and then I've looked outside of myself to see where I've seen consistent energy showing up in similar ways, is that it's about individual boundaries. It's about individual self. It's not participating in a shared idea or a shared thing. It's who are you and your biography and your story and the soul work that comes along with that, right? So it's pointing you back to yourself and then what that journey is about. So that's why astrology can be really powerful at this point in time, because it offers a portal to be able to begin to make contact with that more undifferentiated self. Okay, that's kind of like that Chiron and Aries message at the moment, right? So new healing the self, right? Okay. So yeah, the frameworks that take place within this Leo energy, and the reason why it's a full moon in Leo is not so much like we'll be talking about Leo energy, but I haven't once touched on the Leo energy, right? What I've touched on is the complexity of these charts. The full moon in Leo just represents the necessary need for validation. It's who are you? What is your destiny? What is your internal process? Not what is the shared ideal. But of course, at a consensus level, this is not something that can be fully interpreted and understood. So we're going to experience people who will feel unseen, will feel unheard, will feel that their sense of self is not there. And especially, again, if you have been conditioned into a sense of identity that is objectified, then you are, and ultimately you don't see yourself as an individuated self. You see yourself as a collective identity with rules and regulations and ideals and structures that meet expectations in order to create a certain sense of structure or stability. But it is not your true self. And so this emptiness begins to permeate the culture at the moment, because the loss of meaning begins to permeate, because the structures outside of those, the structures that held that identity together, no longer are there, right? And that's why it permeates this complexity at the moment. And of course, this is also the energy for individuation. So the other side of it is actual activation and individuation, people processing a reality, coming into their truth, making more sense of their world, speaking up for the things that are real for them, collaboration, working together, sharing a message. These things take place. Okay. All right. So I hope that kind of really drives home a message over here. This long piece over here, I wanted to talk about how Sagittarius shows up and how the planetary nodes of Uranus show up. Again, we have one central sense of self, and then that sense of self or core self then bleeds into a perspective. And each of these are frames that help people process, digest the complexity of reality. And each of them have got symbols, Sagittarius. And those symbols communicate a message, those messages that are internalized and then reflected back as exactly that. It's like an interpretation of reality, right? And so the planetary nodes at the moment are, in a sense, fraying these definitions so that these symbols are kind of unraveling at the moment. And as they unravel, they create more Pluto conjunct Venus attachment to the holding on to the symbol. In other words, let's hold on to the symbol. So how are you framing reality is the question, A. B, how is that framing of reality then reflecting where those projected needs cannot be met relative to the outside world not validating it in the way that it is important to you? And so that leads to the emotional dysregulation complex that shows up. Okay. All right. This obviously needs a lot more processing, but I can't sit here for 3 hours doing a video, but I could ultimately talk for it for a long period of time. Okay, peeps. So the next thing that I want to jump onto, and this is fascinating to me on many levels, but I'm obviously aware of your time, so I hope that you can kind of come back to these videos and watch them over and over. So recently, I've been interested in diving into the astrology of Chernobyl, and particularly the disaster that took place, and that is still consistently sort of permeating the town of Pripyat and also Chernobyl itself and what that represents. And the first thing that I wanted to point out was planetary nodes. So remember we talked about planetary nodes? Well, there's the south node of Neptune sitting across that node there, and you can see the north node where the full moon is, right? And then the new moon sitting, sorry, the sun sitting at 9 degrees there. So just off that. So there we have the full moon landing on the line of planetary nodes. Now we all know that Uranus is also sitting in Taurus at the moment, which squares that node. Now, the reason why I'm bringing this up is because look, south node of Uranus sits there, okay? And so I'm going to pause for a second. The 26th of April, 1986 is the chart that you see here, okay? The planetary nodes are where they are obviously in relation to that node. And the reason why I'm saying this is because this is a perfect example of collective or a culture trauma, collective shared interest in processing something that is shared with us all collectively, even though you may have not fully heard of it in that way. And then also why something like HBO would make a series on it to depict certain elements of that experience, right? We are all collectively interacting with it. And then you have somebody like the wife of the fireman, for instance, who shared her story just recently on YouTube, and she talked about her experience and how that's part of her life. That's what the planetary nodes are. They're collective shared experiences that move with us. And when we have events and circumstances that take place, they go with us. They are part of our memory. Okay. So with Chernobyl, for instance, the thing that I want to show you is that, look, there's the south node of Uranus. So Uranus had already moved past that, of course. Saturn is going to move across that area over there. So we have activation. We've got Jupiter sitting at 14 degrees of Pisces, squaring the planetary node of Uranus. We have Chiron on that planetary node of Uranus as well. Okay. We have the north node, which not necessarily, it's on the actual south node and north node of Chiron. So Chiron has a planetary node as well. Look at the activation here, literally. Okay. You can see that there. And then you can also see that the sun is squaring the planetary nodes of Uranus, right? Okay. Now, what's fascinating about this process is obviously that Mars will move across this entire area over the next month in terms of where people are going to have to deal with the fallout. And it's literally a fallout, right? Nuclear energy, right, started with the Manhattan Project, if I'm not mistaken, right? So the first hydrogen bombs were developed there. You can go on the internet and go and research all that. The reason why I said 1930 is because Pluto was discovered. And so Pluto correlates to nuclear energy. It correlates to the DNA, and it correlates to exactly radiation. So Pluto is radiation, Pluto is nuclear energy, Pluto is atomic understanding. So we're not even 100 years into the discovery of Pluto. And the point here is that when you look at humanity interfacing with things that we discover, we are going to develop a relationship to it through trauma. Okay, that's what the south node and north node of Leo, Aquarius, is about. It's like this collective shared experience, and that's through shock and things like that we become aware of what we discover, right? We discover plutonium, we discover nuclear radiation, but we don't actually know the full extent of it. And this is ultimately what happened to the people in Pripyat and the firefighters and all of the people that dedicated their entire lives to not only dealing with this, but also interfacing it with it where they didn't know the extent to which it was going to take place, right? So there's this illumination that and the sacrifice that comes along with that process. Now, the Leo archetype correlates to legacy and hero, but true authentic legacy and hero is not given to people by just going, hey, you know, I want to be seen in a popular way, and so therefore I'm a hero. It's not. It comes through sacrifice. And that's why the Chiron story is so prominent in this process, because we tie into the chart at the moment, because you can see that in this scenario over here, people's needs and the necessary need to be able to interact with this, there was no choice. There was a necessary need for sacrifice that took place. I mean, this is a very complex thing, and I don't want to spend too much time on it because I want to dedicate it to an entire video. I'll probably do a lecture at some point on it. But just to point out these planetary node effects, okay, right? And the message that comes along with that. This is this over here, the message that comes along with that. That's that Chiron energy. Okay. So, I mean, this correlates also to the progressive fall of the USSR as well. This chart has got multiple complex and dynamics to it. But there's somebody that participates in it as well that I want to bring you guys information to. This scene over here is a reflection of Neptune. This is what happens when Neptune, when this town was fully activated and people were there and there was life, and then all of a sudden evacuation. That's Neptune. This is when you hold the image of Neptune, this is an image of the collective in which things that once had structure, meaning, and purpose in life no longer have that anymore. So it's dissolved, it's decayed, it's gone. The things have been displaced. Okay, so this is the decay process. This is the meaninglessness in it. And yet at the same time, when you see this picture, you also see and you connect to the south node of Aquarius, south node of Neptune in Aquarius, which was at once, this was alive, it's north node in Leo, but now it is through this process, we can only just imagine the trauma that exists there. We can imagine the what has occurred in this process. It reminds us of our humanity, and that's the point here. You know, when the nodes of Uranus are activated, Neptune are activated, we are thrust into humanity and what it means to be human. And in this case over here, what it meant to be human was scenarios like this. Okay, right. At this point, this was full with children moving around, playfulness, and now what we see here is something that's empty. Aquarius. It's distant. It is invisible in terms of the fact that when we see that, we are filled with the memory of the experiences there and we are brought into our humanity, but the eeriness and the emptiness of it has got Aquarius undertone, and it actually brings us into our hearts. Do you see this paradox that shows up here with the Leo Aquarius axis, the sun in Aquarius and the north node, the moon in Leo, that when you look at this, at one point it was filled with life, right? So you could see this place filled with life. And yet then when it gets taken away, or, you know, it's evacuated and stuff, what we see here is a memory of the experience. So we see the emptiness, Aquarius, right? The detachment, but in our hearts, we feel. So there's this beautiful axis between life can present itself both in when there is actual life, and then when we're also reminded of the loss of life or the experiences, we are also brought into a deeper state of humanitarianness. And that's why I think also that this event speaks to the Chiron on the nodes, because I've always talked about Chiron's nodal axis being about humanity and bringing us into our actual experience of what it means to be human. And more specifically, that, you know, humanity is about interpersonal relations. And when you remove those interpersonal relations, what we are left with is people that are isolated, that are lack of love, that are lack of interaction. And that causes, you know, whole sorts of complexes within our brain. Chemistry doesn't work well with that, right? We need those primal needs to interact. So Uranus, Aquarius, legacy, right? Dedication, sacrifice. Again, whenever you see the planetary nodes activated and you see things, you will see scenarios take place. So you think about COVID-19, for instance, and, you know, people who are on the front lines, whatever, is sacrifice, right? The forecast of doctors predicted that from 5 of these guys would die before they reach 4 years old. Imagine that that was your life, right? You knew that you needed to clean this up because obviously the effects were going to be deadly for so many people. So you were in a situation where you sacrificed, right, to meet the needs of not only of the situation, but also to be able to meet the needs and the survival needs of an entire planet to a certain degree. The war with an invisible enemy has not ended with the completion of the works on liquidation of the Chernobyl crash. And so this is kind of one of those experiences, dealing with this radiation that's there, and these people having this protective clothing, they know that it's there, but ultimately what they're really saying here in this scenario is your life is sacrificed. And this is also the firefighters that immediately kind of arrived at the place because they just saw it as a fire. And that's what I mean about the nuclear energy, that Aquarius and the south node of Aquarius, north node of Aquarius, is that this is Leo, north node. People are seen as heroes because they arrived at something in which ultimately their life was that was it. Like, they didn't know that they were being exposed to radiation to the degree in which their lives were going to be taken away. And I don't think most of the firefighters lasted more than 3 weeks. And that's something. And put yourself in that position. That's when you can feel shock. That's when you can feel detachment. That's when you can feel loss, in the same way that it is also part of the experience of what it means to really become a hero. And that's, again, when I talked about Chiron, the legacy of Chiron is interacting with one's sense of deeper meaning. And that comes not through the experience of a self-appointed destiny. It comes through your life. It comes through the things you've sacrificed. It comes through the things that you've become aware of, that you needed to, in a sense, know that your choices would ultimately lead to, as in these guys' cases, their death. Okay. So again, putting across the planetary nodes over here, putting across the Uranus, this is what we're remembering at this point in time. And it's not a coincidence that we're going through something similar again, but not in the sense of radiation, but in that way. But the world does propagate the idea of an invisible enemy, and it's difficult. We're all stuck in isolation. We're all stuck in a scenario. And it does bring out complexity of, where are my needs, my projected needs of freedom not being met? And so that creates disgruntledness, that creates that uncertainty, that creates that all of the things that we see, and then we react out of that. And so reaction becomes the forefront of things, as opposed to the revolution, which in this sense, and I don't know if this is entirely the truth in many ways, but it's my interpretation at least, is that if I tie in the original chart and this point over here, we are in a kind of situation where there is a lot of complexity and a lot of non-truth and a lot of uncertainty, and we don't know how to interact with it, right? And so our reactions are driving our desires to try to make sense of things. And when they are rooted in ideologies, Neptune square the nodes on the south and north node of Aquarius, Uranus, then what we experience here is we experience what we see in the world, right? Madness. Okay. There is a person called Valery Legasov, and he was somebody that I think has an interesting mention. He talked about this thing here, right? You can all go on the internet, I'll place it. He said, this guy, Legasov, ultimately committed suicide by hanging himself, okay? And he hanged himself because his role in this scenario was to ultimately inform people of the degree to which this information, the scenario was taking place. And this ties in with the cultural trauma that is experiencing collectively at the moment, with the way that truth and lies, and can you trust something, can you not, and so on and so forth, are taking place. He wanted to expose the things that were more catastrophic. So he recorded himself just before his suicide, explaining, there were unknown facts about the catastrophe, highlighting systemic secrecy, because remember, Pluto was on the nodes. Let me show you here. That's why I also brought it out, because Pluto was actually at 5 degrees of Scorpio, which of course squares the planetary nodes of Neptune. Loss, plutonium energy, secrecy, being exposed. Look there, Moon in Scorpio. The trauma of abandonment, the trauma of loss, the displacement for the people of Pripyat who had to just up and leave. You saw the city, the town. It was completely empty, collective displacement. These are the types of things, right? And North Node and Chiron, the necessary need to act in the moment. I mean, the firefighters were sent because there was a fire. That's North Node and Aries. There was no question. There was not like, oh, okay, what about this or what about that? It was like we needed to act. The urgency of the situation led people to need to deal with something that Sun in Taurus. There's the Sun, right? Come into that. And it's all squaring the planetary nodes there as well. And the uncertainty of the process as well. I mean, there you can see the Capricorn energy, right? This is a process of the structure and how the structure collapsed. You go deeply into it. There's the documentary called The Unseen Documentary of Chernobyl. You can go check that out. That one is really interesting as well, fascinating. But Legasov, he ultimately was in a situation where he was helping people make sense of things, but he also became aware of how a lot of the information was ultimately, like he said, written and removed. We mentioned flaws, things that were not spoken about, North Node in Gemini. Okay, so he was basically saying ultimately there was things that were hidden, and he couldn't deal with that. Right? He knew the scenario. He knew the significance of this. So here's his chart. His chart is the inner wheel. Look where his North Node sits, guys. Right? His North Node is at 1 degree, literally. And if you look at when he died 2 years after the incident, and he killed himself because, according to the information that he had written down, was that he couldn't deal with ultimately what he had discovered, which was lies, secrecy, information that was not being presented correctly, and probably many other things. But look at his chart. His North Node sits at 1 degree Capricorn. His South Node sits there. His Chiron is sitting at 22 degrees of Gemini, and he has a Chiron return. So he dies at 51, right? He can't deal with the information, the misinformation. And of course, there is Uranus. So his Uranus sits at 9 degrees of Taurus. Again, squares the planetary nodes. Look where his Mars sits on the planetary node, right? Sorry. His Mars sits on the 14 degree. He dies when Mars is opposes Mars, and also on the planetary node, okay? We know that the planetary nodes of Saturn, Jupiter sit in Capricorn there as well, okay? Look at where his Saturn sits on the planetary node of Uranus, okay? His Neptune and his Sun sign all sit on the planetary node of Uranus. They're squaring it, okay? Right? His natal Mars squares the planetary node of, or is on the planetary node of Neptune, and his Pluto, wherever it is, it's not actually on the planetary node, but when he dies, his Pluto is squaring the planetary node as well. He is born when Uranus is in Taurus, and his Uranus squares the planetary nodes. When he dies, the North Node is on his Saturn. His North Node is conjunct Uranus, as in transiting Uranus is on the North Node. So is his Saturn, right? The Sun, Jupiter, and Mercury all connect to his Uranus, all squaring the planetary nodes as well, and then also Mars on the planetary nodes. And the reason why I'm bringing this guy up is because ultimately he's seen by the world as a hero, because he, Virgo, his Virgo energy, pointed out there was a massive crisis. He pointed out the severity of the situation. He pointed out that this couldn't be hidden. This couldn't be put aside. So, he talked about the responsibility, the failure of responsibility, the failure of the governmental structures. He talked about the hidden material, Pisces there again. He talked about the severity of how that was going to affect wildlife. He talked about the effects of radiation. And ultimately, this Chiron wound over here that he experienced was the information that was being put across wasn't authentic, it wasn't real, it wasn't truthful. Jupiter in Sag. Look where his Jupiter sits, on the planetary node of the south node of Uranus. Honesty. So he said something that's really, really profound. And he said this. He said, to be a scientist is to be naive. We're so focused on our search for the truth, we fail to consider how few actually want us to find it. But it is always there, whether we see it or not, whether we choose to or not. Okay, look at these energies here. Right, so he was the South Node in Sagittarius. He wanted to point out the truth. His message was to point out this truth, right? He needed to express it. Mars and Leo, right? Again, planetary nodes squaring it. The need to remove the illusion, to move the experience. He says, the truth doesn't care about our needs or our wants. right? Okay. It doesn't care about our governments or our ideologies. Look at that. Look at that. Okay. It will lie in wait for all time. And this, at last, is a gift of Chernobyl. So what he was really talking about here was that to him, he realized, and he probably came to discover, that within the context of the structure, the context of, the structure, there was some misinformation. There was things that were not honest. There were things that were not true. And ultimately, events like this take place. And he was really pointing out this North Node in Capricorn, right, where we needed to take responsibility, where we needed to define, we need to point out the structure, and to point out where the information wasn't true, where the information was hidden, right? He was saying this when Pluto was in Scorpio for all of us. Okay. So he goes, where I once would fear the cost of truth, now I only ask, what is the cost of lies? And this is, again, the Neptune square the nodes at the moment. You all know that the Neptune at the moment is sitting there on the planetary nodes, the exact same point as this. Right? Neptune's at 19 degrees. It's squaring the nodes there as well. Right? We know that at the moment, like the sun's in Aquarius, it's sitting over here on the thing. So this is a collective message. And again, it's not a coincidence with all this energy. We're talking about the sensitivity to needs. We're talking about the ability to recognize where we are interfacing with something bigger than us. But at the same time, we're also pointing out that the collective memory of dishonesty and truth and where it lies and how it works and the structures, we become aware of it. And truth ultimately permeates through that process, and it doesn't care what it takes with it. COVID-19 is one of these things. What we're seeing is not personal, but what we are witnessing is something that's personal. We're experiencing that way. So he goes, every lie we tell incurs a depth to the truth. Sooner or later, that debt is paid. Right? This is kind of the message that he's putting across here at the time and what he mentioned. And I think it's just, I mean, this is another chart that I wanted to point out to you guys over here, right? This is Chernobyl event, Valery's main birth chart, and then when he died, right? So the outer wheel is when he died. The inner wheel is where is his actual birth chart. And then look at Chernobyl. Neptune on the node, and look at that there, right? Look at the Saturn Uranus on his Neptune. Yeah. It's just really, really fascinating. His Jupiter lands on, sorry, not his Jupiter, but Chernobyl's Jupiter lands there. It connects to the 19, it connects to the 20. These are collective activations. So this is what I'm talking about with terms of planetary nodes. And then also to continue in terms of where the chart is of today. Cool. I really hope you found a lot of value in this, peeps. I'll put some description and some links in the description for you to go and check out, for you to go watch. I really hope that you found value. Please share your comments and your thoughts in the comment section as well. I really like that. And yeah, I appreciate that.